I'm actually going to stand over here because we're going to have an opportunity to look through a trip that I had the opportunity to make this past summer over in Israel. Several things took place in that. I had the opportunity to go with a group mostly from Harding. Monty Cox led it, and there were 56, I think, of us all totaled. Almost all of them were in this picture. This particular picture was taken from the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley, and if you see the wall back here, that is the wall that Herod built around the Temple Mount. And so you're looking at Jerusalem, the old part of Jerusalem, standing there. And I love that picture, and I love the thought of that. But it was a wonderful trip. I just wanted to share some things with you, but particularly from the aspect of following Jesus and looking at some of the things some of the places he would have been, some of the paths he would have taken in and around Jerusalem and Galilee. Just a wonderful opportunity. If you ever have that opportunity to go, please take advantage of that. I thought that was one of those things that was just out of my ability or out of my chance to ever have a chance to go to something like that. But just a wonderful trip. And I want to take you on a little bit of the journey, thinking particularly as we walk with Jesus. Okay? Where did you grow up? You grew up in the city of Nazareth, but this picture of Nazareth today is very much unlike what it would have been back in the days of Jesus. In the days of Jesus, probably 200 to 300 people, max, probably not very many folks to have to look at right there. I mean, just very few. A couple of different things you'll see right here, this little dome-shaped building here kind of in the middle. Supposedly that is where Mary received the announcement that she would be with child, and it'll be the Son of God. But this was the boyhood home of Jesus. Matthew 2, verse 23 says that they came and they resided in a city called Nazareth. That was Joseph and Mary brought him there after they'd been in Egypt for a couple of years, you remember? And then that they came back to what was his city. Also, this particular picture is up from what is called Mount Precipice. Do you remember the story there of Nazareth, that he comes back to his own hometown in Luke chapter 4? And that doesn't go as well as what he thought it might, or it doesn't go as well as what we think it might. It started pretty well. Everything began pretty well. He came to Nazareth. This is looking at the plains of Jezreel from Mount Precipice, just outside the city of Nazareth. But you remember that he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and he entered the synagogue, and he begins to preach, and everybody is speaking well of him until he starts talking about speaking to folks who aren't Jewish. And they don't actually do very well with that. It says that all the synagogue was filled with rage, and they led him to the brow of the hill. This is believed to be that hill. And they were going to throw him off the cliff. They were going to get rid of him. So as far as beginning his ministry, it didn't go quite as well as what you might have thought it was going to. We had the chance to go to the Sea of Galilee, which was north of there. And the Sea of Galilee is a center point of so many things that took place in the ministry of Jesus' life. We've just read some things that took place. He walks by the Sea of Galilee. He calls a couple of the brothers to come and to be with him and to follow after him. He calls them to be his disciples, and they do just exactly that. One of the things that we got to do pretty quickly after being in this particular area, there's a lot of, what would we call it? There's a lot of touristic kind of things in and around. We had the opportunity to go to see what's called the Jesus boat. Now, no way to know and no way to be able to say, okay, this is the boat that Jesus stood in and preached to everybody else. What we do know from the way that it's been dated and everything else is that it would have been around during about the time of Jesus' ministry around Galilee. The nails that were found, you'll see that it's got all kinds of things around it. The wood has been dated as well. It has a big, huge display there. And it reminds me of some of these passages in Luke chapter 5. He got into one of the boats and he sat down and began to teach the multitudes. So as these kinds of things are in front of you, as you're walking around some of these places, these are the kinds of passages that come back to mind, and it's like, that's a real place, and these are real stories, and these are real artifacts that could have been from that particular time. And so, again, you can see the nails that are down here in this kind of the picture, and some of the other things that were there. It's not in very good shape. They found it in mud, and it was down in the bottom of the mud right here and had been preserved for many, many years. It was almost like mush, and so they had to be extremely careful in the way that they brought it out, and there's all kinds of things there in this particular area that talk about it also. Some of the dating, how can it be dating in this? You'll see one of the pots that was right there, again, dated about the same time. If you can see, not very well, but right here are a group of nails that were used, and it would have come from that particular time as well. But it's just kind of neat to think about that being there about that particular time. And they used the same thought right here, from fishers of men, or fishers of fish to fishers of men, and bringing people to faith, and bringing these men to faith as well. Well, it's not enough just to look at the Sea of Galilee. You got to do more than look at it. You got to go sail. Now, this is not Noah's Ark. You'll see on the side of the boat, that's Noah. There are about 25 of these boats. They're taking tours out. That is not the Ark. But we did get to sail on the Sea of Galilee. In fact, I got a shirt that said, "I've sailed the Sea of Galilee." Kind of a cool thing, but a lot of different things happened right there. Remember, the feeding of the 5,000 happened there beside the Sea of Galilee. The demoniac was cured when he went to the other side, over to the Gadarenes, right? The leper was cleansed there as well. A lot of different things that took place in and around that sea. But the things that we probably remember the most is when that sea began to be really big. In fact, it's just a big lake. It's a harp-shaped lake, and that's where it got one of its names from, was that harp-shaped, if you look from the hills looking down. And you'll see the hills around it. It's surrounded by hills. The Sea of Galilee is actually 600 feet below sea level. We know about the Dead Sea being below sea level, but also the Sea of Galilee is below sea level as well. But this is the place, or one of the places, on this lake that Jesus would have said, "Hush, be still," and it became as calm as glass. From the Sea of Galilee, we went up on a mountain called the Mount of the Beatitudes. And you can see the hill looking down across, and the hills around the Sea of Galilee right there. And as we were there, we got to hear not only the Beatitudes, but we got to hear the whole of the Sermon on the Mount, sitting there, listening, and looking across the Sea of Galilee. It was one of those kind of moments where you just, you're not jumping up and down, and you're not running around, you're not all excited, but you are very calm and you're just taking it in. It's one of those kind of things where you're just going, I'm really here. And I kept having to pinch myself, right? Am I really here? Am I really getting to experience some of these things? But it was just a wonderful opportunity to hear these words sitting in this particular area. From there, we went on around to Capernaum. What do you remember about Capernaum? And you're already looking at the slide going, well, that's Jesus' home, right? That became his other hometown after he left Nazareth, became what people call the town of Jesus. Matthew chapter 4, verse 13, and over there in chapter 9, verse 1, says that he left Nazareth, and he came and he settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea. And he came there in chapter 9, verse 1, he came back to his own hometown. Well, a couple of things that take place. Again, there are churches everywhere. People have built churches on what are considered holy sites and sites from way back. This particular area, you can kind of see this is what they have found and what they've discovered and uncovered at this particular point. But you'll see over to the side right here, and I've got a better picture here coming up. You'll see this particular picture has all of these stones that are down below. And above this, you'll see the concrete right here. Well, that's a church building that's set up. And they didn't want to cover up what has been discovered was the synagogue of Capernaum. And so these stones right here would have been the outline where the synagogue was, where Jesus would have taught. That's pretty cool, isn't it? That's one of those kind of things where you're going, he was here. He was in this particular place. A lot of other things happened in that particular area as well, that he arose and he left the synagogue and he entered into Simon Peter's home. Had to have been pretty close. Had to have been there fairly close. Now notice, I have blown up this little white sign that you see up here, the late 4th century, or the white stones, but you notice the dark stones below? You see the darker gray and almost black colored stones? That again is from the period, the 1st century, where Jesus would have been. And so the synagogue right there and the synagogue buildings in and around would have been there. And so again, just some really cool thoughts about him actually having been there. What all did he do while he was at Capernaum? You remember some of the things? First of all, it was the home of the 4 fishermen, Peter and Andrew and James and John. They fished there on the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum right there beside it. Healing of the centurion servant in Matthew chapter 8. The home of Matthew, his tax office, was here as well. The healing of the nobleman's son in John chapter 4. The healing of the paralytic in Luke chapter 5. Remember, take up your mat and walk. The healing of Jairus' daughter in Matthew 9. And then, along with Capernaum and Bethsaida and Chorazin, do you remember the woe that was pronounced on this city? Because there were all kinds of miracles that were done in and around this particular area, and they remained in their unbelief. Amazing that just because there are a lot of miracles done does not automatically create faith in people. If you decide that you don't want to believe, you're not going to believe. And a lot of folks had the opportunity to see Jesus at work doing these things in these places and chose for themselves not to believe. Amazing, isn't it? From Capernaum, we went around the Sea of Galilee a little further over to a place called Magdala. Know anything about Magdala? There was a lady named Mary, and she was called Mary Magdalene from Magdala. This has only been discovered in the last few years. They hadn't discovered it before right here. You'll see that they're building some shelter over the top of this as they continue to dig and unearth some things. But a very recent discovery right here, and gave us some different things to look at. You'll see behind this particular area is a whole display area of different things that they have unearthed, and you can go in and look at several of those as well. This just gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the different things that they have discovered. And if you look, the synagogue, there was a synagogue there. We have for sure, no biblical text that says that he was actually there, but it was right in that same approximate area. Very likely he probably at least went through this particular area too. And a lot of the other things that were found during this, already during this time. So Mary, who was called Magdalene, from whom the 7 demons had come. That particular area was of interest to us as well. We went north from there, and we went to Caesarea Philippi. This is called the Temple of Pan. You'll see that in a sign that's further over, but this was also where a temple of Augustus was built. And this particular area, you remember what happened in Caesarea Philippi? Matthew chapter 16, right? What was the question? Who do you say that I am? There are a lot of other folks that are talking about me, and they're saying that I might be John the Baptist come back to life, or I might be one of the prophets, or I might be Jeremiah or somebody else. But the real question isn't just who do other folks say that I am. Jesus said to his disciples, but who do you say that I am? Surrounded by this area where you've got this temple of Augustus that was built, this area that had been a place of worship for a long time, the question comes, do you know who I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. I don't think Peter understood what that meant, because in just a few moments after that, Jesus turns around from calling him blessed to calling him Satan, because he doesn't understand. He says, you don't have the mind of God, you've got the things in mind of man. But this is the area, the grotto. In fact, where'd you go, Corey? As you talked about this a couple of years ago, they believed that this was even the entrance of hell. So again, the kind of thinking behind this is Jesus big enough and is he strong enough to conquer even the demonic world? Seems that question helps us understand some of those things. This is Mount Tabor, believed to be the traditional place of his transfiguration, where he takes Peter, right? James and John. Peter can't be quiet because he's so nervous and he's so anxious with everything, and he's just going off at the mouth right here. Let's build this tabernacle. Let's build this. And we'll do all these things right here. And God has to tell Peter to hush. Now, I guess when God tells you to hush, you hush, right? And so he did. But this seems to be that particular place. Matthew chapter 17, he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as light. And this, again, just outside of the Sea of Galilee. We move down into Judea. This is a full size, not a full size, but a model of what Jerusalem would have looked like. You can see down here in this would have been the temple area and the temple courts during the time of Herod. You'll see the different areas of housing that were the older ones first, and then this area back here that began to be built. We'll talk more about this little area right here that have the spires and the columns right here. But this is a model of the first century Jerusalem. And so from there we got to go to those walls and began to look at them for ourselves and to see Jerusalem is still there. This is not a place long, long ago and a place far, far away. This is a real place. The old part of Jerusalem is still there. And you have the chance to kind of look and to see and to be impressed with the size of the city, to be impressed with the size of the stones that were there. We actually got to go down into what would be almost like a cave underneath and see some of the original stones from the temple as well. This is called the Wailing Wall. Have you seen that in video or in pictures before of the rabbis? You'll see one of the rabbis right here. And you can't tell, but he's rocking. He's got his little prayer book up, and he's rocking back and forth. And he's praying. Most of the rabbis, their prayer book, they're praying for Messiah to come. They don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and so they're still praying for the Messiah to come. If we could get up close enough, and you probably have seen pictures of this as well, but if we could get up close enough, you would see this fellow right here, right here, this guy right here. Almost everybody who comes up, when they come up to the wall, then they place a piece of paper with a prayer on it in the seams between the stones. They believe that the glory, the Shekinah glory of God is emanating out of these stones. They can't get to the temple anymore. That's not theirs anymore. And so they believe that the Shekinah glory of God is emanating out of the seams of these stones. And so they're placing these pieces of paper in the prayers, asking for the Messiah to come, hoping that the Messiah will show up. We got to return on a couple of nights after this on the day of Pentecost. Is that kind of cool to get to go to Pentecost in Jerusalem on Pentecost? Except for them, it's not a day of great celebration. You would think so with this. At least they don't celebrate what we celebrate. There was all kinds of music and dancing and party and all kinds of things that were going on, but they're not celebrating the beginning of the church here. They're celebrating what they believe to be King David's birthday. They don't believe the church was ever established. They don't care about the things that Christians would talk about. And this whole area, this whole complex was filled with folks who are still waiting for Messiah. How sad. How sad. From there, we got to do some more walking. This is called the Pool of Bethesda. You remember? What took place at the Pool of Bethesda? John chapter 5, there by the sheep gate, a pool which is called Bethesda, and there was a man who had been there for 30, or had been blind, had been lame for 38 years. And the question that Jesus asked him, do you remember? Do you want to get well? And for us, it's like, well, duh. Why? That's why I'm here, right? But if you read through that whole context of John chapter 5, it says that he was waiting for the waters to be stirred. And John kind of gives us either his thoughts, or the traditional thought is that the angel of the Lord would come from time to time and would stir the waters. And the waters would roil, or they would bubble up right here, and they would place, and whoever got placed in the water first, then they would be healed. And the man would tell Jesus, Somebody gets in the water before I do. I can't get there as quickly as somebody else. But they're waiting for the angel of the Lord when the Son of God is standing right there in front of him. We had a chance to go to another pool. This is called the Pool of Siloam. And in John chapter 9, it says that he saw a man that was blind from birth, and he told him to go wash in the pool. Do you remember the question the disciples had of Jesus? Who sinned, this man or his parents, that this man was born blind? And Jesus said, nobody sinned. This was so that the glory of God and so the works of God could be on display. And he talks about himself being the light of the world, and then he opens up the eyes of this blind man. This is just a picture from the up above, an aerial view of the Temple Mount today. And looking at that area, it gives you kind of a picture. This is a very large complex where Herod had come in and leveled these things out and set it all up. But it made me remember Luke chapter 19, that he was teaching daily in the temple courts. And he's bringing all kinds of folks. You could see that there are a lot of folks that could fit into a place like this, and a lot of people could hear him. He would lament over Jerusalem as he comes into Jerusalem. He would speak parables of the fig tree and the 10 virgins and the talents, and to be ready here. He would talk about the Christ's return, and all of these things would take place in the last few days of his life. This particular picture is coming from the Garden of Gethsemane, looking back at the temple, and you see the dome here that's over the dome called the Dome of the Rock, where the original temple and the Holy of Holies would have been. But notice something interesting. We were in Gethsemane, looking back across the valley. Notice this bridge right here. And I didn't get a picture, but right about here is a gate coming out of the city of Jerusalem. It's where the men with swords and clubs and torches would have exited to come to Jesus to find him in the Garden of Gethsemane that night. We got to sit there. We got to have some time in devotional, some time of reflection to think about what all would have taken place. Jesus came to the place called Gethsemane. One of the areas in this garden that has been very well taken care of has this in it as well. My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but as you will. We had a chance to think about the prayers. We had a chance to think about the agony. We had a chance to think about and think on the resolve to do God's will rather than to do his own will. From here, we had the opportunity to go to Caiaphas' house. You remember Caiaphas? The high priest at that particular time. John chapter 18, verse 13, it says that they led him to Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. So we had that chance to look at this whole area, pottery and all kinds of other things that have been reflected that tells us that it was indeed his house. Now, again, those who seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest. From there, just around the corner from there, we went to this particular church for just a moment. You're thinking, why would you put a church up there, Kevin? What does that have to do? Anybody notice the name of the church? Spanish speakers? It's in Latin. Gai cantu. And immediately, the cock crowed. It's the place, supposedly, where Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And immediately that rooster crows to let him know that's what Jesus said was going to happen anyway. Again, I mentioned before that this is the area called the Fortress Antonio. You'll remember that after they went to Caiaphas, then they brought him back to what was called the Praetorium. They brought him back before Pilate, where Pilate would have lived in this particular area, where the governor would have been. And in this particular area right here, they took Jesus into the Praetorium and they gathered the whole Roman cohort around him, and they stripped him and spat on him and beat him and mocked him. This is where in this area, somewhere in this particular complex, where that would have taken place. The Via Dolorosa, this is the way of the cross. The real wording here would be the way of pain. It is the place where Jesus would have walked. And in Luke chapter 23, it says that they led him away from those particular places out to be crucified. This is called the place of the skull. Can you see it? Does it look like a place of a skull on a hill? John chapter 19, verses 17 and 18 tells us that that's exactly Golgotha, is where they crucified Jesus. This picture here was taken back in the early 1900s. It's even more pronounced in the picture there beside it. But you can see kind of the two eyes, the nose, and maybe the mouth right here. It was just named that because of what it looked like. Gordon's Calvary, they call it today. And from there, his body would have been taken off of the cross and taken to what is typically called the garden tomb. It was discovered several years ago, John chapter 20, verse 41. In that place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb. We had the chance to stop and to look in, to spend a little bit of time thinking about and looking at this place of preparation. We don't know that this is where he was laid, but someplace like it, something very similar to it. But this is where they bound the body of Jesus, as was the custom of the Jews, and they laid him there. What did they do after they placed him in the tomb? The big rock, remember? The large stone. Mark chapter 15, verses 46, and then again over in chapter 16, verse 4, it says they rolled a stone against the entrance, and this stone was extremely large. But the stone didn't stay in front of the tomb, did it? The tomb was removed, and they found it on Sunday morning that it had been rolled away, it had been taken away, and even in one of the Gospels it says the angels were sitting on it and asking the women, why are you looking for somebody who's alive in the place of the dead? Well, from there, I close today with just where we started, back on the Mount of Olives. Because at the end of the story is found in the first part of the book of Acts. And in the Mount of Olives, in Acts chapter 1, verses 9 through 12, they ascend the Mount of Olives, and he tells them some final words. You're going to be my witnesses, right? Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the world. And it says, while he ascended, while he was taken out of their view, two angels appeared to them and said, why are you gaping? Why are you staring up into the heavens? He's coming back in the same way that he left. And so we wait, not necessarily from the Mount of Olives, but from wherever we are, we wait for his next coming. Thank you.